I, 28, female, never expected my life to become a battleground. But that is exactly what it felt like every time my mother-in-law, Margaret, was in the room. She was a master of the subtle insult, the backhanded compliment that left you feeling small without knowing exactly why. For years, I had smiled through it, held my tongue, and reminded myself that she was my husband, Alex's mother. I loved Alex, 30 male, and for his sake, I was willing to endure a lifetime of her quiet disapproval. I thought I was strong enough to handle it. I thought I could keep the peace forever. But forever came to an end at her retirement party, in front of everyone she had ever known, when she looked me dead in the eye and said the quiet part out loud. The party was exactly as Margaret had planned it. She had spent months organizing every detail, from the color of the napkins to the playlist of soft jazz that hummed in the background. It was held in the large, manicured backyard of the house she had lived in for 40 years, the house where Alex grew up. Friends from her long career as a school administrator mingled with family members, all of them offering congratulations and praise. Margaret moved through the crowd like a queen, accepting tributes with a gracious smile that never quite reached her eyes. Alex and I had done our part. We had paid for the catering, a fact Margaret conveniently omitted when people complimented the food. We had spent the morning setting up tables and hanging decorations. I had even baked her favorite lemon cake, which sat untouched on the dessert table while she praised a store-bought pie brought by her sister. I was used to it. It was the price of admission to her world. I was standing near the patio, talking to one of Alex's cousins, when Margaret decided it was time for her speech. She tapped a glass with a spoon, and a hush fell over the 50 or so guests. Alex moved to my side and squeezed my hand. He knew these moments were hard for me. He always tried to be a silent source of support. Margaret started by thanking everyone for coming. She spoke about her long and fulfilling career, the students she had guided, the colleagues she would miss. It was all very polished, very standard. Then her eyes found Alex. "And of course," she said, her voice filled with a dramatic warmth that made my skin crawl, "I have to thank my wonderful son, Alex. He has always been my rock, my greatest achievement." She paused, and her gaze shifted to me. The smile on her face tightened just a fraction. "He is a good man, a wonderful son. He tries so hard to be a good husband, too." The compliment felt like a slap. An undercurrent of suggestion rippled through her words, implying that his effort was a struggle, that his marriage was a challenge he had to overcome. A few people shifted uncomfortably. I felt Alex's grip on my hand tighten. He felt it too. I kept my expression neutral, a pleasant, supportive mask I had perfected over the years. I would not give her the satisfaction of a reaction. I would not let her ruin her own party. But Margaret was not finished. She was building to a grand finale, and I was to be the main event. She raised her glass higher. "A mother's greatest wish is to see her children happy," she declared, her eyes still locked on me. "And I see how hard my son works. He provides, he supports, he gives everything he has." She took a deliberate step toward me, closing the distance until she was standing right in front of us. The entire party was watching, a silent audience to a play I never auditioned for. "I just worry," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial, concerned tone that was far more damning than a shout. "I worry that he doesn't get the same in return. A man needs a wife who builds him up, who makes his home a sanctuary, not someone who distracts him." The word hung in the air, thick with unspoken accusations. I could feel dozens of pairs of eyes on me, judging me, wondering what I had done to earn the matriarch's public disapproval. I felt my face flush with heat. I wanted the ground to open up and swallow me whole. This was beyond her usual jabs. This was a public execution. Alex started to speak, but Margaret held up a hand to silence him. "No, Alex, let me finish. I am your mother. I have a right to be concerned." She turned back to me, her expression a perfect blend of pity and contempt. She leaned in, as if sharing a secret, but her voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're a terrible wife." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. All the air left my lungs. The polite chatter, the music, the chirping of birds in the trees, it all faded into a deafening roar in my ears. It was not just an insult. It was a verdict, delivered in front of our family and her friends. She had stripped me of my dignity, painted me as a failure, and cemented her own narrative of the long-suffering mother whose son had married beneath him. For a moment I could not move, I could not breathe. I just stood there, my hand limp in Alex's, feeling the weight of every eye on me. I saw pity on some faces, curiosity on others, and on the face of her daughter, Clara, a smug satisfaction. She had always been her mother's ally in this silent war. I felt Alex start to tremble with rage beside me. I could feel the fury rolling off him. I expected him to yell, to defend me, to cause a scene that would only make things worse. But he did something else entirely. He let go of my hand. He took a slow, deliberate breath, and the anger on his face was replaced by an unnerving calm. He looked at his mother, not with the hurt of a wounded son, but with the cold detachment of a stranger. "You think so?" he asked, his voice steady and low. "You think she's a terrible wife?" His calm was more frightening than any shout. Margaret seemed taken aback. She had expected a fight, tears, a dramatic confrontation where she could play the victim. This quiet strength was not part of her script. "I know so," she sniffed, trying to regain control. "I see how you are. You're tired all the time. She has you wrapped around her little finger." She was trying to frame it as concern for him, a classic manipulation tactic. But Alex was not falling for it. Not anymore. He shook his head slowly. "No, Mom. You don't see anything. You only see what you want to see." He turned slightly and looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw not just love, but a promise. A promise that this was over. He had reached his limit. He then reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. My heart pounded in my chest. What was he doing? What could he possibly have in his pocket that could change this? Margaret watched him, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes for the first time. The entire party was frozen, watching the unfolding drama. Alex's movements were slow and precise. He pulled out a folded set of documents. They were crisp and official-looking. He unfolded the paperwork, holding it up so his mother could see the letterhead. I could not read it from my angle, but I saw the color drain from Margaret's face. "You're right about one thing, Mom," Alex said, his voice ringing with a clarity that cut through the tension. "A man's home should be his sanctuary." He took a step toward her, holding the papers out. "But you seem to be confused about whose home this actually is." The crowd gasped. Margaret stared at the papers as if they were a snake. She looked from the documents to Alex's face, her expression a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. I had no idea what was happening, but for the first time all evening, I felt a flicker of hope. The power dynamic had shifted. The ground had moved beneath Margaret's feet, and my husband was the one who had moved it. To understand what that paperwork meant, you have to understand the years that led up to that moment. I, 28F, always tried to get along with my mother-in-law, Margaret. When Alex and I first started dating, she was perfectly lovely. She invited me to family dinners, asked about my job, and told me stories about Alex as a little boy. I thought we were building a real relationship. The change was so gradual, I almost did not notice it. It started after we got engaged. Her compliments began to have sharp edges. "That's a lovely dress, dear," she would say. "A bit simple for a family event, but it suits you." Or, "You're so ambitious with your career. It's a shame you won't have much time for a family." Each comment was a tiny paper cut. Alone, they were nothing. But over time, they bled me dry. Alex, bless his heart, often missed the subtext. He would hear the compliment, not the sting that came after it. "Mom likes you," he would say. "She's just from a different generation." I tried to believe him. I made excuses for her. I told myself she was just protective of her only son. I told myself that her daughter, Clara, was her favorite, and that was just the way it was. Clara could do no wrong. Her messy divorce was a tragedy. Her financial problems were just bad luck. My promotion at work, however, was a sign I was neglecting my husband. My decision to save for a down payment on our own place was seen as an attempt to steal her son away from her. The real trouble started a year before the retirement party. Alex's father, David, passed away after a short illness. It was a devastating loss for everyone. David had been the buffer between Margaret and the world. He was a kind, quiet man who adored Alex and had always treated me with warmth and respect. He saw his wife's flaws, and he had a gentle way of steering her away from her worst impulses. With him gone, her behavior went from subtly manipulative to openly hostile. She seemed to view me as a rival for Alex's attention and, more importantly, his resources. The first major incident happened about 6 months after David's death. Margaret called Alex in a panic. The roof was leaking, she said, and the repair was going to cost thousands of dollars. She was on a fixed income now, she cried, and she did not know what she would do. Alex, being the good son he was, immediately offered to pay for it. I agreed, of course. It was his childhood home. But I had a nagging feeling. I called a reputable roofing company for a second quote, just to be sure. Their estimate came in at less than half of what Margaret's contractor had quoted. When I presented this to Alex, he was hesitant. "Mom trusts her guy," he said. "Let's just get the second opinion," I urged. "It can't hurt." Reluctantly, he agreed. The second roofer came out and found a few loose shingles, a simple repair that would cost a few $100s, not thousands. There was no major leak. Margaret had lied. When Alex confronted her, she burst into tears. "I must have misunderstood," she wailed. "That man is a crook, trying to take advantage of a poor old widow." She spun a story of being confused and scared, and Alex, wanting to believe his mother was a victim and not a liar, accepted it. I did not. That was the first time I realized she was capable of blatant deception for financial gain. I started paying closer attention. The catalyst that set the stage for the party was her retirement itself. She had been planning this grand affair for a year. She wanted a lavish party to celebrate her decades of service. She presented us with a budget that was astronomical. "This is my legacy," she said. "It has to be perfect." The budget included a string quartet, a custom ice sculpture, and a champagne fountain. Alex and I looked at the numbers in disbelief. It was more than we had in our savings account. "Mom, this is a lot," Alex said gently. "We can help, of course, but we can't cover all of this." Margaret's face fell. "But I was counting on you," she said, her voice trembling. "I have my pension, but it's not enough for a proper celebration. Your father, God rest his soul, would have wanted me to have this." She was using his memory as a weapon. It was a low blow, and it worked on Alex. He was torn. He wanted to honor his father's memory and make his mother happy. "Maybe we can cut back on a few things," I suggested, trying to be the voice of reason. "Do you really need an ice sculpture?" Margaret shot me a look of pure venom. "This is not about what I need," she hissed. "It's about what I deserve. You wouldn't understand. You think about everything in terms of dollars and cents." This was deeply unfair. We were the ones being responsible. She was the one making unreasonable demands. The conversation ended in a stalemate. Alex promised to see what they could do, a vague commitment that left Margaret angry and me deeply unsettled. A few days later, Alex and I were having dinner when his phone buzzed. It was a text from his sister, Clara. He read it, and his face went pale. "What is it?" I asked. He handed me the phone. The text read, "Mom is a wreck. I can't believe you're being so selfish. After all she's done for you, she's thinking of taking out a loan to pay for her own party because her son and his wife are too cheap to help." I felt a surge of anger. They were painting us as the villains, Clara was fueling the fire just as she always did. "This is insane," I said, handing the phone back to him. "We offered to help. We just can't afford to spend $20,000 on a party." Alex sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know. But now Clara is involved. The whole family will hear about this. We'll be the ungrateful son and the horrible daughter-in-law." He was right. Margaret and Clara were experts at managing the family narrative. They would spin this story until we were social outcasts. "So, what do?" I asked. "Do we just give in? Drain our savings for a party we can't afford to make her happy for one night?" Alex was quiet for a long time. He stared out the window, a conflict raging within him. I saw the struggle on his face, the son who loved his mother versus the husband who knew this was wrong. Finally, he turned to me. "No," he said, his voice firm. "We're not going to do that, but I need to figure out what's really going on. This isn't just about a party. She's been different since Dad died. Desperate." That was the moment everything changed. It was the first time Alex acknowledged that the problem was not just my imagination. He saw it too. He was ready to stop making excuses and start looking for answers. The next day, he went to his mother's house alone. He wanted to have a calm, rational conversation with her, man to man, or rather, son to mother. I waited at home, anxious. He was gone for hours. When he came back, he looked defeated. "How did it go?" I asked. He sank onto the sofa and put his head in his hands. "It was a disaster," he said. "I tried to talk to her about the budget, about her finances in general. I asked her if she was okay. She accused me of calling her incompetent. She said I was being controlled by you. She said you were poisoning me against her." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with pain. "She told me I had to choose. Her or you." My heart broke for him. His own mother had given him an ultimatum. It was a cruel, manipulative tactic designed to isolate him and force him to comply. "What did you say?" I whispered. "I told her that was a ridiculous thing to say," he said. "I told her you are my wife and we are a team. And then she started crying, saying I didn't love her anymore. I had to leave. I couldn't stand it." We sat in silence for a while. The battle lines had been drawn. Margaret had made it clear that there was no room for me and her family. This was not about a party. It was a power struggle. And she was willing to destroy her relationship with her son to win it. "There's something she's not telling us," Alex said finally, his voice hard. "Dad handled all the money. I don't think she has any idea what she's doing. Or maybe she does and she's hiding something." He stood up and started pacing. "I need to find out. I need to see Dad's old files. He kept everything in his study. She never goes in there. It's too painful for her, she says." That weekend, we went back to the house. We told Margaret we were there to pick up a few of Alex's old childhood things from the attic. It was a plausible excuse. While I kept her distracted in the kitchen, asking her about recipes and listening to her complain about her neighbors, Alex slipped into his father's old study. The room was just as David had left it. It was a sanctuary of books and papers, a map of a quiet and orderly life. Alex knew where his father kept the important documents, in an old metal filing cabinet in the corner. He found what he was looking for almost immediately. A thick folder labeled Household Finances. He tucked it under his arm and came back out to the kitchen. We made our excuses and left, the folder feeling like a stolen secret between us. That night, we spread the contents of the folder across our dining room table. There were bank statements, investment reports, mortgage documents, and insurance policies. At first glance, everything seemed normal. David had been a meticulous record keeper. His pension and investments should have been more than enough to support Margaret comfortably for the rest of her life. But as we dug deeper, we started to notice strange things. There were statements from a credit card we had never heard of, with a balance that was shockingly high. There were letters from a lender regarding a home equity line of credit that had been taken out just 2 months after David's death. The balance on that was also substantial. "Oh my God," I breathed, pointing to the documents. She's been borrowing against the house. Alex stared at the papers, his face grim. She told me she was fine. She told me Dad left her with everything she needed. He picked up a credit card statement. The charges were a litany of luxury. Expensive clothes, spa days, dinners at fancy restaurants, a trip for her and Clara to a resort. She was living a lifestyle far beyond her means, burning through money at an alarming rate. The lavish party was not a one-time expense. It was the tip of the iceberg. She was drowning in debt, and she had been lying to us about it for months. This is why she's so desperate, I said. She's out of money. The party is just another expense she can't afford. Alex nodded, his expression hardening. The hurt was being replaced by a cold anger. She lied to us. She tried to manipulate us into paying for her lifestyle, and when we said no, she tried to turn me against you. He shuffled through the papers, his movements becoming more frantic. There has to be more. Dad would not have left her in a position where she could do this. He knew she was careless with money. He always handled it. Then he found it. Tucked at the very back of the folder was a thin envelope with his name on it, written in his father's familiar handwriting. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was not a letter, but a single key and a small, folded note. The note was short and to the point. It read, "Son, if you are reading this, it means I am gone and you are worried. This key is for my personal safe deposit box at the downtown bank. There are some documents in there you need to see. I trust you will know what to do with them. Do not let your mother's pride ruin the future I built for you. I love you. Dad." A single tear rolled down Alex's cheek. It was a message from the grave, a final act of a father trying to protect his son. David had known this day might come. He had foreseen his wife's recklessness and had put a contingency plan in place. We looked at each other, the weight of the discovery settling between us. We now had a mission. We had to get to that safe deposit box. We had to uncover the full truth that David had hidden away, a truth he believed would be the key to securing Alex's future, and by extension, mine. The next morning, we drove to the bank. The air in the car was thick with anticipation and dread. We had no idea what we were about to find, but we knew it would change everything. The bank was an old, imposing building with marble columns and high ceilings. It felt like a temple of secrets. Alex presented the key and his father's death certificate to a stern-looking woman behind a counter. She led us through a heavy vault door into a small, private room lined with metal boxes. She used her key and ours to open box number 347. She slid the long metal container out and placed it on the table in front of us, then left, closing the door softly behind her. For a moment, we just stared at it. This box held the answers David had left for his son. Alex took a deep breath and lifted the lid. Inside, there was no money, no jewelry, no valuables in the traditional sense. There was just a single, thick, manila envelope. It was sealed with wax, stamped with the insignia of a law firm. Alex's name was written on the front. He broke the seal and pulled out a stack of documents. They were dense with legal language, but the heading on the first page was clear: Irrevocable Trust Agreement. We spent the next hour reading through the paperwork, our initial confusion slowly giving way to a stunned understanding. I had to read some sentences 2 or 3 times for the meaning to sink in. David, a man I had thought of as simple and kind, had been incredibly shrewd. Years before his death, seeing the early signs of Margaret's financial irresponsibility, he had taken steps to protect his largest asset, the family home. He had worked with his lawyer to place the house into an irrevocable trust. The trust named Alex as the primary beneficiary. I was named as the secondary beneficiary. Margaret was not a beneficiary at all. The document was very specific. She was granted the right to live in the house for the remainder of her life under certain conditions. She was, for all legal purposes, a tenant in her own home. The conditions were spelled out in unforgiving detail. She was responsible for the minor upkeep and property taxes, to be paid from a specific account David had funded for that purpose. She was forbidden from taking out any loans or liens against the property. The trust was the sole owner, and the trustee, designated as Alex upon his father's death, had the final say in all matters concerning the property. If she violated the terms, such as by failing to pay the taxes or by attempting to use the house as collateral, the trustee had the right to evict her. My mind was reeling. This was a bombshell. Margaret had no idea. She clearly believed the house was hers, a belief she had leveraged to secure a massive home equity loan. A loan that was, according to this document, completely fraudulent. She had lied to the bank, claiming ownership of a property she did not own. Alex was silent, reading the final page. It was a personal letter from his father, attached to the legal document. He read it aloud, his voice thick with emotion. Alex, the letter began, I know this must be a shock. I'm sorry to have kept the secret from you. But I did it to protect you. Your mother is a good woman in many ways, but she is like a child with money. She cannot see beyond the present moment. I have watched her spend us into trouble more than once, and I always manage to fix it. I will not be there to fix it anymore. I could not bear the thought of her losing this house, your childhood home, because of a foolish mistake. This trust is not a punishment. It is a protection. It ensures that you will always have this home, that it can be a foundation for your own family one day. It gives your mother a place to live without the burden of ownership, a burden, I fear, she cannot handle. You are the trustee now. The responsibility is yours. I trust you to be fair, but I also trust you to be firm. Do not let her manipulate you. Your future is what matters now. Be happy, son. That is all I ever wanted for you. When he finished reading, Alex folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. He looked at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. He knew, he whispered. All this time, he knew exactly who she was. The feeling in the room was a strange mix of grief and vindication. Grief for the father who had to go to such lengths to protect his family from within, and vindication for me. All the years I had spent feeling like I was crazy, that I was too sensitive, that I was imagining Margaret's manipulations were washed away. David had seen it too. He had seen it, and he had acted. The loan she took out, I said, my mind racing. It's fraud. She lied to the bank. Alex nodded, a grim look on his face. She must have forged some documents. The bank would have required proof of ownership. This was more than just irresponsible spending. This was a crime. The depth of her desperation was staggering. She was willing to break the law to fund her lifestyle and her retirement party. What do we do now? I asked. Alex was quiet for a long moment, staring at the trust documents. I could see the wheels turning in his head. He was processing the betrayal, the lies, the immense responsibility his father had just handed him. He was no longer just a son. He was a trustee, a guardian of his own future. When he finally looked up, his expression was changed. The sadness was gone, replaced by a steely resolve I had never seen in him before. For now, he said, his voice low and steady, we do nothing. We let her have her party. We'll pay for the catering, just like we promised. We'll smile and we'll play our parts. I was confused. Why? After all this, why would we do that? He picked up the trust agreement and tapped it with his finger. Because Dad asked me to be fair. I'm going to give her one last chance to be a mother, not a monster. But I'm going to be firm, just like he asked. He made a copy of the key documents on his phone. And I'm going to have this with me. His plan was clear to me then. He was not going to confront her privately. He was not going to let this play out behind closed doors where she could cry and manipulate and twist the narrative. He was going to wait. He was going to see what she would do. And if she pushed him, if she chose to attack us, he was going to be ready. He was going to use the truth his father had left him, not as a sword for a preemptive strike, but as a shield to be raised only when attacked. The retirement party was no longer just a celebration. It was a stage, and Margaret had no idea that her son was now holding the script. The week leading up to the party was one of the strangest of my life. We went about our lives as if nothing had happened. We confirmed the caterer. We answered Margaret's frantic calls about floral arrangements and seating charts. We listened to her complain that we were not being enthusiastic enough. Through it all, a silent understanding passed between me and Alex. We were a team, united by a secret that was both a burden and a source of incredible strength. Knowing we held the truth made it easier to endure her little digs and passive-aggressive comments. They were the desperate jabs of a woman who had no idea how precarious her position truly was. Clara called Alex several times, her voice dripping with artificial concern. "You need to be there for Mom," she'd say. "This party is the only thing holding her together, and you and Chloe are making it so much harder for her by being so difficult about money." Alex was a master of non-committal responses. "We're doing everything we can, Clara," he'd say, his voice perfectly calm. His restraint was incredible. I, on the other hand, was a nervous wreck. I felt like I was living in a spy movie. I kept expecting Margaret to somehow find out what we knew. The day of the party arrived, a bright, sunny Saturday. As we drove to her house, the copies of the trust documents felt like they were burning a hole in Alex's jacket pocket. "Are you sure about this?" I asked him one last time. "What if she doesn't say anything? What if she's perfectly nice all day?" Alex looked over at me and smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "She won't be," he said. "She can't help herself. She's going to try to prove to everyone that she's the victim and you're the villain. It's the only move she has left." He was right. From the moment we arrived, the performance began. She greeted Alex with a hug that was overly dramatic, clinging to him for a moment too long. She barely acknowledged me, offering a curt nod before turning away. Throughout the afternoon, she made a point of telling anyone who would listen how wonderful her daughter, Clara, was. "Clara organized all the decorations," she said, conveniently forgetting that I had spent 4 hours hanging them. "Clara has such wonderful taste." When an old friend complimented my cake, Margaret chimed in, "Yes, it's nice. But you must try the pie Clara brought. It's simply divine." I played my part. I smiled. I made small talk. I refilled drinks. I was the perfect, supportive daughter-in-law. But inside, I was watching the clock, my stomach twisting into tighter and tighter knots. Every polite conversation felt like the calm before a storm. And then, the moment came. She tapped the glass for her speech. Alex moved to my side, and I felt his hand find mine. It was time. We stood there as she went through her speech, the carefully crafted words designed to paint a picture of herself as a beloved matriarch. And then, she turned on me. It started with the veiled insults about my ambition, about Alex trying so hard to be a good husband. I felt the collective gaze of the party shift to me. The air grew thick with tension. I could feel what was coming. It was like watching a car crash in slow motion. And then, she delivered the final blow, the line she had been building to all day, all year, perhaps for our entire relationship. "You're a terrible wife." The world stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. In that moment, she had everything she wanted. She had publicly shamed me. She had asserted her dominance. She had, in her mind, won. I saw the triumphant gleam in her eye, the smug little smile on Clara's face. They thought they had broken me. They thought Alex would be forced to choose, and that in the ensuing chaos, he would ultimately choose his mother. It was a terrible, desperate gamble, and she had just gone all in, but she had miscalculated. She had underestimated her son. She had underestimated the man his father had raised him to be. And she had no idea about the secret he carried in his pocket. When Alex let go of my hand and stepped forward, a profound sense of calm washed over me. I was no longer scared. I was a spectator now. The battle was his to fight, and he was armed with the truth. "You think so?" he asked, his voice cutting through the silence. "You think she is a terrible wife?" His question hung in the air, a direct challenge to her authority. Margaret, flustered by his lack of a fiery defense, doubled down. "I know so," she said, her voice rising. "I see how she drains the life out of you. This is my house, and I will not stand by and watch her ruin my son." It was the perfect opening. She had mentioned the house. She had laid the trap for herself. "That's interesting," Alex said, his voice dangerously quiet. He reached into his pocket. "Because I have some paperwork here that says otherwise." He pulled out the folded documents. The crowd murmured. This was not the family drama they had expected. This was something else entirely. Margaret stared at the papers, her bravado faltering. "What is that?" she stammered. "What are you doing?" "My duty," Alex said simply. He unfolded the first page of the trust agreement. "You mentioned that this is your house. According to this document, a trust established by my father, David Miller. You are mistaken. The house is owned by the Miller Family Trust." He paused, letting the words sink in. You could have heard a pin drop. Margaret's face went from pale to ashen. Clara, standing beside her, looked utterly bewildered. "What are you talking about?" Clara interjected, finding her voice. "That's ridiculous. This house has been in our family for 50 years. It's Mom's." Alex did not even look at his sister. His eyes were fixed on his mother. "Dad was a very smart man," he continued, his voice calm and methodical. "He knew that you weren't good with money, Mom. He was worried you would lose the house, so he put it in a trust to protect it. To protect me." He then looked at me. "And to protect my wife, Chloe," who he named as the secondary beneficiary. A collective gasp went through the crowd. I was not just the outsider. I was a named heir, chosen by the man whose memory Margaret so frequently invoked. The narrative she had so carefully constructed was crumbling around her. "The trust grants you the right to live here, Mom," Alex went on, his voice softening slightly, though his eyes remained hard. "But you are a resident, a tenant. You don't own the property. The trust does. And I am the trustee." He let that last piece of information hang in the air. He was not just her son anymore. He was, in a legal sense, her landlord. The power dynamic had not just shifted. It had been completely inverted. Margaret was speechless. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She looked around at the faces of her friends and family, but found no support. They were all staring at her, their expressions a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. They were reevaluating every story she had ever told them, every complaint she had ever made about me. But Alex was not finished. He had one more card to play. "The thing is, Mom, as a resident, you have certain obligations and certain restrictions." He held up another document. It was a copy of the home equity loan she had taken out. "For instance, you're not allowed to use the house as collateral for a loan, so I'm very confused about this. It's a loan for $100,000 taken out against this house. A house you don't own." The silence was now so profound it was almost painful. The crime he had spoken of in private was now public knowledge. She had not just been irresponsible. She had committed fraud. She had stolen, in effect, from her own son's inheritance. "You lied to the bank, Mom," Alex said, his voice filled with a quiet sorrow. "And you lied to us. All this time, you've been telling us we're terrible people for not giving you money for a party, when you've been sitting on a fraudulent loan and burning through it on who knows what." He folded the papers and put them back in his pocket. "So you can call my wife a terrible wife. You can call me a terrible son. But you are the one who broke my father's trust. You are the one who lied and who stole." He looked around at the stunned guests. "I think this party is over. With that, he took my hand. Let's go, Chloe. We turned and walked away. We walked past the silent guests, past his stunned sister, and past his mother, who stood frozen in the middle of her perfect lawn, in the ruins of her perfect life. We did not look back. We got in our car and drove away, leaving the wreckage behind us. The silence in the car was not uncomfortable. It was peaceful. It was the sound of a long war finally being over. The aftermath was both chaotic and quiet. Our phones started ringing before we even got home. The first call was from Clara. Alex put it on speaker. "What did you do?" she shrieked, her voice hysterical. "You humiliated her! You destroyed her! In front of everyone!" Alex waited for her to finish. "She did that to herself, Clara," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "She called my wife a terrible person in front of 50 people. She lied. She committed fraud. What did you expect me to do? Stand there and take it?" "She's our mother!" Clara cried. "You're supposed to protect her." "I am protecting our father's legacy," Alex replied. "Something you never seemed to care about. Did you know she was in debt? Did you know she took out that loan?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. She told me she had some savings from Dad," Clara stammered. "She said she wanted to use it for the party." "She lied to you too, then," Alex said. "She used you to try and manipulate me, as usual." The accusation hit its mark. Clara was silent. "I have to go," she mumbled and hung up. The next call was from Alex's aunt, his father's sister, Martha. Her tone was completely different. "Alex," she said, her voice soft, "I just wanted to call and say your father would be so proud of you." Alex was taken aback. "You think so?" "I know so," she said firmly. "David worried about Margaret for years. He loved her, but he wasn't blind. He told me once that he was afraid she would end up with nothing if he wasn't there to manage things. That trust, it was his final act of love. For both of you, you did the right thing today. You stood up for your wife and for your father's wishes. It took guts." Her words were a balm on a very raw wound. To have someone in the family understand, to validate their actions, meant the world to both of us. We did not hear from Margaret for 3 days. In that time, the story spread through the family like wildfire. The narrative she had controlled for so long was no longer hers. The truth, as it often does, was more compelling than her fiction. People who had once sympathized with the poor widow were now seeing her in a new light, as a manipulative and deceptive woman who had tried to ruin her son's marriage. Some of her friends called Alex to apologize for not seeing the situation for what it was. The social standing she had prized so highly was dissolving. On the 3rd day, Margaret called. Alex answered. Putting the phone on speaker again, her voice was small, defeated. "Alex?" she whispered. "Can we talk?" "We are talking," he said, his tone neutral. I'm so sorry," she said, and the tears began. They were the same tears she had used to manipulate him his entire life. But this time, they had no effect. "What are you sorry for, Mom?" Alex asked. "Are you sorry you called Chloe a terrible wife? Are you sorry you lied about your finances? Are you sorry you committed bank fraud?" Her crying intensified. "I was just so scared," she sobbed. "After your father died, I was all alone. I didn't know what to do." It was a classic attempt to play the victim, to reframe her actions as a consequence of grief and fear. Alex was not buying it. "You weren't alone, Mom. You had me, you had Clara, you had a whole family. But you pushed us away. You lied to us. You tried to turn me against my own wife. That's not fear. That's malice." There was a long silence, broken only by her sobs. "What's going to happen now?" she finally asked, her voice trembling. This was the real question. This was what she was truly afraid of. Losing her home, losing her financial security. "That depends," Alex said. "First, you are going to call the bank. You are going to confess to the fraudulent loan. You are going to work with them to set up a payment plan. I have already spoken to a lawyer. The trust will not be held liable for your debt, but your cooperation with the bank is non-negotiable." "But I don't have any money," she wailed. "You will sell your car," Alex said, his voice like ice. "You will sell your expensive jewelry. You will sell the designer clothes you bought with that money. You will liquidate every asset you have to start paying back that loan. Your pension will be redirected to an account that I control. From it, I will pay the property taxes and the utilities for the house. You will be given a small fixed allowance for groceries and personal necessities. Nothing more. You will live on a strict budget until the debt is cleared." The terms were harsh, but they were fair. They were the consequences of her own actions. She would not be homeless. She would have a roof over her head and food to eat. But her life of luxury, a life funded by lies, was over. "And what about Chloe?" she whispered. "You will apologize to her," Alex said. "A real, sincere apology. And after that, you will have no contact with her. None at all. If you want to see me, you will call and schedule a time. I will meet you in a public place. You are no longer welcome in our home, and you are not to speak a single negative word about my wife to anyone ever again. If you violate any of these terms, I will exercise my right as trustee and have you removed from the house. Do you understand?" She understood. Through her tears, she agreed to everything. Her power was gone. Her ability to manipulate, to control, to inflict emotional damage had been stripped away. All she had left was a place to live, and even that was conditional on her good behavior. The next day, she called me. Her apology was stilted and awkward, but it was an apology nonetheless. I accepted it. Not because I believed she was sincere, but because it was the final piece of a resolution we had fought so hard for. I told her I wished her well, and then I hung up. I blocked her number. It was over. In the months that followed, a new normal settled in. Alex managed his mother's finances with the detached efficiency of an accountant. He made sure her bills were paid and that she had enough to live on. He met with her once a month for coffee. He told me their conversations were strained, mostly focused on superficial topics. She never mentioned me, and he never mentioned her. Clara, after a few more angry phone calls, eventually retreated into sullen silence. Her relationship with Alex was fractured, perhaps permanently. She had chosen her side, and she had chosen wrong. As for me and Alex, we had never been stronger. The crisis had forged our bond into something unbreakable. We had faced the worst his family could throw at us, and we had not just survived. We had triumphed. We continued to save, and a year after the infamous retirement party, we bought a home of our own. It was not as large or as grand as his childhood home, but it was ours. It was a place of peace, a sanctuary we had built together, free from manipulation and toxicity. I saw Margaret one last time, about 2 years later. We were at a distant cousin's wedding. She was there with Clara. She looked older, smaller. The expensive clothes were gone, replaced by a simple dress. She saw me from across the room. Our eyes met for a brief moment. I saw no hatred in her gaze, no anger. I saw only a kind of weary resignation. She gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod, and then turned away. It was not forgiveness. It was an acknowledgement of a truth she could no longer deny. I had not been a terrible wife. I had been the wife her son deserved. And she, in the end, had been the architect of her own lonely, quiet life. She had lost everything that mattered, not because of me, but because she had never understood the difference between control and love. Alex and I left the wedding early. We went home to our quiet house, to our peaceful life. We had won.